time, and we have seen the value discussions in the campaign. I hope that the series was helpful to you as you think about the responsibility of every citizen to vote, to make his personal decision on the day of election. Now we go to this series on Islam. Remember last January in discussions of the troubled children of Abraham, there was a desire expressed for further exploration of this extraordinary phenomenon called Islam. And so we have set up this series for this month. While I'm making announcements, I might also say that we are going to have a series on the new genetics and Christian faith after the Islamic series. And I think that that will be an extraordinarily interesting series for all of us. Let's look to the question of Islam. And the first question, of course, is why should we as Christians concern ourselves with Islam? And I would say there are three answers to that. First, Christians and Muslims, and of course Jews, are members of sibling faiths. Like the Hebrews and the Christians, Muslims count themselves the children of Abraham, though you remember via Hagar and Ishmael, rather than Rachel and Isaac, and that all Arabs consider themselves of this line, so that the linkage goes right back to Abraham from their point of view. More significantly, the Muslims are absolutely adamant that they worship the one true God, who is the same one true God that Hebrews and Christians worship. The Muslims say they go even farther. They are totally monotheistic, but we'll get into that a bit later and their complaints about the Christians on that score. Together, these three faiths all constitute the people of the book, with the Islamic teaching being that God confirmed the teachings of the Hebrew Testament and the New Testament, but corrected and perfected those teachings so that the Quran is, from their point of view, the final statement of God's message to mankind. That's the first reason. The second reason why we should be concerned is, of course, that today Muslims around the world number more than 1 billion people. No religion other than Christianity has anything like as many adherents. Two-thirds of these people are in Asia, 670 million in the mid-1990s. Almost 300 million are in Africa. 14 million are in Europe, 43 million in the former Soviet states of Central Asia, and 3+ million, although I think now Muslims would say maybe 5 or 6 million, in North America. This Muslim sweep goes right across from the Atlantic Ocean, Casablanca, through the Middle East, south into Africa, north into southeastern Europe, on into Central Asia and China, and south through India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, which 4 countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, are the largest, have the largest aggregations of Muslims in the world, many more than any Middle Eastern country or other. And so, in our interdependent age, there is just no way in which 1/5 of the human race can be ignored by those of us who are of an elder sibling relationship to the Abrahamic beliefs. The third reason is the significance of political Islam. Like political Christianity before it, which expanded over much of the Western world and which influenced the organization and construction and values of many societies, So Islam, in its wide expansion, has influenced cultural and legal and social concepts in a way that has been utterly activist. And of course, if you read this morning's newspaper, this morning's New York Times, if you've already read it, you will see a long article on Jerusalem pointing out the fundamental conflict between the Jewish position as expressed by Israeli Zionists and the Muslim position as expressed by the PLO and other Arabic organizations. Witness our involvement with political Islam in Bosnia, in the Arab-Israel dispute, in Kashmir, in Mindanao in the Philippines, and elsewhere. Political Islam is dynamic. We are concerned, many people, because of its fundamentalist characteristics as they are described. And we know that in the next generation, the role of Islam in the world is going to be a significant factor in international relations. So here are three reasons why this question is of concern to us: the sibling face, the number of Muslims, and the role of political Islam. So let's go back and take a look. Whence cameth Islam? With all Arabs perceived as having derived from Abraham and Hagar and Ishmael as the other Semitic people, the Arabian desert, if you can put your mind back to the 6th century of the Common Era, the Arabian desert with its desert fastnesses, its nomadic Bedouin tribes, and its trading centers, linked by camel caravans that crossed the dunes like ships at sea. This was a society and an area that had moved through the ages in a particular rhythm with the development of trading centers and camel caravans that crisscrossed the desert to areas as distant as the Byzantine Empire and Persia and Abyssinia. And the nodules in this society were in the trading centers, of which Mecca was an important one. Important and prosperous. Mecca was a town, a trading town, held by the Arab tribe of Quraysh, but with a substantial Jewish population and a number of Christians as well, all or most of them involved in the trading activity. The Quraysh, like other Arabs in the pre-Islamic times, were polytheistic. They believed in a variety of divinities in the stones and in the trees where there were trees and so on. The Jews, of course, were monotheistic, and the Christian converts from Judaism who were there also monotheistic. It was in this relatively cosmopolitan town, cosmopolitan by the standards of those days, that Muhammad was born in 570 of the Common Era. His family, although poor, belonged to the Quraysh tribe, the dominant tribe there, and was respected, although distant from power and wealth. His father died before he was born. His mother died when he was still very young. He was brought up by a grandfather and then by an uncle. Clearly an extraordinarily talented youth. He so impressed the employer whose camels he came as a youth to manage in their travels to Damascus, that when he was about 25, she proposed marriage to him. She was the widow Khadija, aged about 40 then, wealthy, and potent. She saw in this young man a person of very great promise, and indeed they married, and for the rest of her life, she was one of his very strong supporters. They had 2 sons who died in infancy, and 4 daughters, 2 of whose husbands became later caliphs of Islam. Even as a youth, Muhammad had 1 or 2 experiences, according to tradition, that disturbed him because they seemed to mix reality with dreams. At about age 40, he had a shattering experience. One night he dreamt that he was visited by the angel Gabriel. When he woke, he was so disturbed by the message that he had gotten, which was clearly in his mind, that he became anxious, feared himself possessed, and by tradition is said to have decided to kill himself. But on the way to the precipice over which he was to throw himself, he was stopped by a voice from heaven hailing him as the apostle of God. That was, as I say, when he was about 40. For the next 23 years until he died, every Muslim in the world will tell you the visions continued. He was told God's will by the mediation of the angel Gabriel. These revelations that came to him were specific and graphic, and in the Arab tradition, when he came out of the revelation, out of the vision, remembered them exactly, memorized them, told them to a few friends, and gradually through the years, they were written down. But in the desert tradition, they didn't have to be written. The oral memory is fabulous, and they have they went through the ages, it is said, without change. These revelations came to him not in the order in which they appear in the Quran, but from time to time. And it was he who decided where in the structure which had already been revealed a new revelation should be put. And so the organization of the Quran is hard to describe or even perceive from a scholarly point of view. He really was troubled by this at first, but a cousin of Khadijah persuaded them he'd not been caught by the devil, but was in fact being called by God. Again, the message was that this was God's final holy word, accepting what God had given to the Hebrews through the prophets, and by extension to the Christians, but correcting and perfecting it, so that this would be the final revelation. From the start to finish, Muhammad preached the almighty power of God and man's submission to God. The word Islam means submission. There is no God but God. This was significant to the Muslims because it challenged their belief even of what the Jewish monotheism was about, but particularly what the Christian so-called monotheism was, so-called, and they didn't agree. They found the concept of Mother of God disturbing and not monotheistic. They found Son of God suggesting that there was something other than no God but God, a single entity. And so he was, and his followers became adamantly monotheistic in every sense of the term. Mecca dominated by the Quraysh tribe and by other Arab tribes with their worship of various deities, had become something of a tourist center because the holy rock, the Kaaba, was there and people would come. And there were gods associated with the Kaaba, deities associated with the Kaaba. And Muhammad challenged that profoundly. When he did, the people of Mecca got angry and began to resist and oppose him. He thought, so this tradition goes, that the Jews would support him with their monotheistic idea. But they didn't, because they also were involved in trade and business and so on, he says. And therefore, the economic aspects of the place of Mecca were more important than the issue of monotheism or something else. But he pressed his message, and the people of Mecca became angrier and angrier. And finally, in 622 of the Common Era, he and his followers, who had started with just a few secret companions but then had grown, migrated from Mecca to Medina. And it was in that year, 622 in the Christian calendar, that the community of Islam, the so-called Ummah, found its base in Medina, and that the Muslim era was started. And so it is from 622 that Muslim 1 begins. And Muslims, as you know, follow the lunar calendar, so very, very slowly they've been catching up with the Western calendar through the centuries, but they're still way behind. This movement to Medina, the Hijrah, was also a time when the tribal loyalties, which have been central in Arab society, were merged into a common commitment to the concept of the one God and Muhammad, his prophet. And from then on, Islam, the Muslim community, became a dynamic force. People in Mecca still resisted what Muhammad had done, and some in Medina did, bringing pitched battles in succeeding years, which the Muslims won against high odds. And in 629, 7 years after the Hijrah, the Muslims seized Mecca and purified the Kaaba, which became the center of the Islamic faith. And then 3 years after that, suddenly in 632, Muhammad died. Tradition has it, and I want to read this, that Muhammad was carried one night from the precincts of the Kaaba to the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the most famous mosque there. On his fabled stab Burak, he ascended through the 7 heavens, where he was acclaimed by all the major prophets, especially Moses and Jesus. Eventually, he reached the divine throne in the presence of God. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem commemorates the spot from which Muhammad is said to have ascended into heaven. Muhammad was not seen as a divine figure. Neither was Jesus. Both of them were considered by Muslims to be messengers of God, human messengers of God, in a very special relationship to the rest of humanity, but not divine in their own sense. Well, Muslims have their own measure of Muhammad, which they devote their lives to understanding. What is it that we can say about him? And again, I'd like to read something from a noted Western scholar who has written that his ability as a statesman faced with problems of extraordinary complexity is truly amazing. With all the power of armies, police, and civil service, no Arab has ever succeeded in holding his countrymen together as he did. Trustworthy tradition depicts a man of amazing ability in winning men's hearts by persuasion and in coercing and disarming his opponents. If we ignore the legendary claims to miraculous powers, powers which he himself expressly disclaimed, he stands out as one of the great figures of history. And I think that is a very wide judgment. So in one lifetime, this new religious body was created with a dynamic that carried it with immense speed across very large areas. Within 6 years of Muhammad's death, 9 years after the capture of Mecca, the Muslims controlled all of Syria and Iraq on the far side of the Arabian Desert from Mecca and Medina. And 4 years later, they controlled Egypt. They went on with that, from that. And in the first century, they swept on across North Africa into Morocco, up into Spain, and into France, to the gates of Constantinople, far across Central Asia, and up the Indus River in India. An extraordinary accomplishment. But not all the result of military arms. In the first place, the military campaign was perhaps easier than it might have been because two great empires, the Byzantines and the Persians, which had been struggling with each other for generations, were at the point of exhaustion and to some extent were shells of their prior strength and were ready to collapse when hit hard from the outside. But in the second place, the spread of Islam was not all military. It was accompanied by a huge cultural surge. New sciences were developed in this intellectual vigor that they had, philology and history, and especially law, Muslim law. They drew on Greek and Persian and Iranian, Persian and Indian sources. The invention of the zero by the Indians was absorbed by the Arabs and became part of their mathematics. A dynamic period of greatness intellectually. But all through that period, as in our decade, there were constant struggles on the part of religious authority to subordinate intellectual activity. We see today, obviously, in Muslim countries, this issue as to who should be the dynamic controlling force. I remember a long time ago in 1940, I was living in Lahore and did a paper on new thought trends of Islam in Lahore at that time. It was a time when it seemed to me and to others that there was a modernization dynamic that had taken on Islam, and that there was a generation of Islamic thinkers who were really fusing modern scientific and other intellectual knowledge with the traditions of Islam in a way which was bringing about what we would call a liberal Islam. Today, when one visits Lahore, the mood has shifted and the conservative forces are strong again. It goes back and forth, but the important thing was that the spread of Islam was not merely a military operation. It did include the involvement of people in a renaissance of their own. And it had its ups and downs. By the 10th century, the spread was very wide. By the 13th century, the challenge from the Ottomans and the Mughals, from the Mongols, I'm sorry, had cut into the Muslim areas. In the 16th century, the Mughals and the Ottomans restored Islam's reach. And in the 18th century, when those regimes began to falter, a phenomenon was apparent, which was that the impact of Islam on the societies which had been non-Islamic, whether Arab or Hindu or whatever, was so strong that the collapse of the regime had not caused a diminution of the social structure of Islam. And so today, when you find in many countries non-Islamic governments, you still find dynamic Islamic societies. So these, in very crude outline, suggest the origins of the faith of Islam as a global community. The promise of today's title included also some reference to Muslim relations with Israelis and Christians. We did, of course, deal with this question in the series on the troubled children of Abraham, but it's a continuing question. Muhammad's relations with Christians were relatively easy. There weren't many of them in Mecca, and some of them apparently, according to tradition, helped him to think through the implications of monotheism. His relations with the Jews of that community were very rough. He was disappointed that they did not follow him and support his claim to the significance of monotheism. He was disappointed that they stuck with the Quraysh and the other Arabs in challenging him and pushing him and his people out of Mecca in order to keep the tourist trade, according to his point of view. He thought that in some respects they had been treacherous. But the revelations authenticated the Hebrew and New Testaments, and he never questioned that. The Jews rejected his claim to be the apostle of God, and is including of Ishmael and Jesus among God's chosen messengers. As the Muslims later moved into the fringes of Christian-ruled lands, the Byzantine area, for example, the Muslim doctrine about relations with Jews and Christians had to be sorted out. And it was then that it was agreed that as people of the book, they would be protected, but that they would have to pay a tribute in one way or another. Through the years, we could go on to the conflicts between Islam and the sibling faiths, the Crusades, the extension into Spain and Europe, the newer issues. I hope you will look at this morning's New York Times and see the fresh reading of the ancient issue of whose is Jerusalem. But we will get onto this again, I'm sure, in the third session. Just as next week, we will get into the structure and organization and tenets of Islam, which I have purposely avoided this morning. We have a few minutes left, and I wonder whether you have any questions or comments about the growth and development of Islam and its importance in the world. Yeah, Ron.
One question, where did Muhammad get some of his knowledge? On the one hand, we're told that he had no religious training and all this was by divine revelation. Obviously, he had no religious training. How would he know about Gabriel? And was there any truth that he lived in a Christian community in that part of the world, and he sort of moved away from that?
Clearly, we're in the area of speculation and an effort to answer just this question. The scholars now think that he was in contact with a number of Christians, and that there was one Christian monastery, or at least monk, not far from Mecca, where, with his interest in retreat and in contemplation, he met people, and it would have been hard for him not to discuss these ideas that were coming to him by revelation. One's guess, taking the revelations as being a real part of his consciousness, that he must have discussed them with these Christian and other leaders, and probably with the Jews as well, and developed his thinking out of that. But you're absolutely right. He was clearly familiar with the genealogy of the Old Testament and a lot of its tenets, and with the New Testament. At that time, Christianity was, 6 centuries old, and it had expanded west, but it also expanded into the Arab world. And so there were convert communities from the Arabs there. And I imagine that if one were to try to give a clear answer, it would have to be that there were a number of sources, but primarily people whom he may have encountered that helped him to understand the revelations he got. Bill.
Yeah, you mentioned that prior to Muhammad organizing Islam as a force, that it was sort of tribal, nomadic, polytheistic worship. Did they consider themselves part of a religion? In other words, what was their relationship to Christianity and Judaism? Were they just indifferent to it, or did they consider themselves as part of some religion?
The Arab tribes had a very heavy tribal focus. They were Arabs, even more specifically, they were Quraysh, if they were of this very important tribe. They had and practiced the observance of a number of divinities, which were, to my mind, not too dissimilar from divinities we found in other societies, India, for example, and elsewhere. Divinities in the natural elements of the world. The Jews by then were separate tribes with their own beliefs, as we know from the Old Testament. And the Arabs did not accept those before Muhammad. They looked at the Jews much as the Europeans during the Middle Ages did, as a separate community, very much involved with trade and so on, with its own beliefs, but not affecting the attitude of or the values of the majority. There were fewer Christian converts, but while some of the Arab tribes, or people in some of the Arab tribes, have been converted to Christianity, many had not. So it was what we would call a pagan set of faiths that dominated the question of the meaning of life in most of the Arab tribes. And it was Muhammad who changed that so completely.
Do the Hindus predate the Muslims?
Yes. Hinduism evolved from a melding of the Aryans who came across Persia and into India in about the 15th century BC, and the indigenous population already there, who had their own beliefs, earth goddess and so on and so forth. Hinduism in the first millennium before the Christian era had taken shape, so that by the beginning of the Christian era, it was well formed and shaped. Islam, of course, came in the 7th century. Yes, ma'am.
Was the trouble with the Jews purely economic, or was it like in the Bible where Jesus had trouble with some of the Jewish sects, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Was it that kind of conflict, or was it an economic conflict because of trade things, or was it both?
To answer questions like this, we have really the Quran as a source, and a few of the traditions. If there are Jewish sources about the contact with the beginning of Islam, I just don't happen to know about them. But the answer, I'm sure, would be that there were difficulties. There was in the Quran reference to a Jewish figure named Ezra, who was presumed to be in some divine relationship to the supreme being, and the Muslims complained about that, and the Jews scorned, as I mentioned, and challenged the inclusion of Ishmael as one of God's real messengers, and of Jesus. So the differences were theological as well as economic. David?
I wonder if you have any experience, you obviously have, with discussing on a basis of friendship with our Muslims and things. I just wish I had heard a lecture such as you have given us now when I was at seminary, but we didn't get enough of that. And I don't think we've given our people enough in the church instruction about Islam. I'm thinking now of the fact that when I was in one particular German prison camp, I gave a series of lectures on the Christian faith. The audience were about 100 senior officers of the British Army, but it also included some Pakistanis. I'd never heard the name Pakistani until I went to that camp and got to know one of these Indians, as they were, who introduced me to the word Pakistan. He said, "You'll hear about that later." And we for quite a while, but it came along. Well, he came to all my lectures, more faithfully than almost any of the others. And he had contributions to make, and one day I gave what I thought was the most important lecture that's since been published, this Christmas Quest, and it was about the significance of Christ. And I made it come to the climax of what do we mean by God being love, and that the Christian faith stood for a supreme example of God's love, and that the Christian ethic was to be based on Christ's ethic and ethic of love. He sought me out after this lecture. He said, "You know, David, what you said today about love, about God's love, and our duty to live in that way is absolutely right. I believe that as a Muslim, but it doesn't work."
But it doesn't work.
Is that a typical reaction?
Muslims who are anxious about the label of fundamentalism and militarism that has been attached to Islam will argue that indeed God is love, and that the submission to God of a Muslim or any human brings with it the responsibility to love one's fellows, one's neighbors. And that's one of the respects in which the Quran teaches much that is comparable to the Bible. Of course, both the Bible and the Quran have some pretty rough passages too. I mean, Deuteronomy is sometimes compared to some of the more challenging parts of the Quran. I remember once, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, being in Pakistan, and I went out to the headquarters of the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is a very conservative, fundamentalist, religious and political movement that has provided some of the dynamic of such things as the Muslim fundamentalists in Afghanistan now. And I asked him about some of the Islamic beliefs, and we're talking about the Sharia, Muslim law, which he insisted was the governing law. He had no room for civil law. And he said, well, you know, the reason that God sent the Prophet Muhammad was that the Prophet Jesus had not been able to finish his task. That the Prophet Jesus gave much on the side of moral behavior and relationship to God, but he was cut down early and did not have time to organize the social structure by which his convictions could be developed and applied in society. He didn't develop anything like the Sharia, the Muslim law. And so he said God had to call another prophet to complete the job. And Islamic law and many of the Islamic beliefs are the completion of the, he didn't call them beliefs, many of the Islamic tenets are the completion of what Jesus, a righteous man, began. The problem and issue, of course, in all, I would say, certainly many religious communities, is that human practice varies considerably from divine ordinance. And Muslims, when they're charged with being militaristic, recite the history of Christianity as a militaristic faith from the Crusades to the Holocaust. And it's a little bit like an American political campaign. If you begin telling each other's faults, there's no end of it. This has been very much the case. The intriguing thing to me now is that Islam remains such a strong force in the minds of those who follow it, in some respects, in a very liberal way. There are in places like Egypt and Malaysia and India and elsewhere, strong feminist movements in Islam now. Women's groups getting together and saying that all the interpreters of the Quran for all these 14 centuries have been males, and that they have misread many of the passages in the Quran, and they're making a dent. On the other side, there is the dogmatic assertiveness of the Taliban today in Afghanistan that harks back to the desert tribal practices, as if there had been nothing in human history since the 6th century or 7th century.
I got the impression when you were talking that you suggested that the Ottomans held back the power of the Muslims, except my understanding of the Ottomans' conquest of the Balkans, for example, they were responsible for the spread of it.
I'm afraid I misspoke. I at one point said Ottoman when I meant Mongol. I think I tried to correct myself, but the Ottomans, the Turks, of course, were Muslim. They had been converted well before that, and they ended the Byzantine Empire in 1453, leading to the eclipse in a large part of that portion of the world of the Orthodox Christian religion. Constantinople had been founded in the 4th century. And for 1,000 years, as my Greek friends used to tell me, Greeks ruled the world from Constantinople. But by the 15th century, that time was over. And then came the spread of the Ottomans across into Southeast Europe, even Greece and so on, and beyond to Egypt and North Africa. And that was a new Islamic wave.
I have to take issue with you on only one point.
Really?
Introductory modesty was not justified. We should all be that ignorant. I have done really comparative religion since I studied in Berlin under von Glasner more than a half century ago. But I've done a lot of thinking about it. And there were all things that intrigued me, but which are very hard to generalize. Islam, if it has done anything for us, is that it saved culture for the West in the Dark Ages.
It did.
Because the scholastics of the Middle Ages would not have been possible without Plato and Aristotle and others being saved by Islam.
Alexandria.
And that is one point. The other point is that very often Islam is maligned because we encounter it very often in its most vulgar forms. Our Christian Church at last has something like this also. Because many of these people who blow up buildings and do all these other lovely things are motivated by ethics which I think Mohammed would not have accepted.
That's right.
It assures them of a place in paradise if they blow themselves up. But the paradise is a monkey's paradise. Unlimited sex and unlimited bananas. And that, of course, casts a shadow over the great accomplishments. But what fascinated me 50 years ago, still does, is that I see in the birth of Islam something which in that part of the world was not really new. Because if you look at the Old Testament, I'm going back to the earliest parts of it, there is definitely two lines of thought which ultimately get intermarried, and this is the Yahwists and the Elohists. The Yahwists were always people of the desert, really. Their life was organized in a way which made them stern, very demanding. The Elohists, they had settled, they found out that there are easier ways to make a living. Now, both of them had something to contribute. But this tension of this settled, fairly earthly orientation, and the strong rules of the desert appear in our oldest biblical writings.
Yeah.
And to me, this is again a replay before, except that for once now, the stern part, which meanwhile has been modified, made a real impact on the existing religion. And so, I'm sorry, stray ideas, but they came to my mind in different order.
Certainly so. This has been an ugly period in many respects, and we see in Bosnia now, to my mind, one of the ugly faces of Christianity, as well as of Islam. The problems there are considerable, and the behavior has not been what one would have hoped. Also, you mentioned the names of God, and of course Allah is linked in with the other.
So may I
Yes.
ask if you have a word of wisdom for us on what to me has always been one of the great paradoxes of religious thought and history. Take two great religious leaders, Muhammad, John Calvin. There are no two religious leaders who are more utterly convinced and taught more firmly of the total sovereignty of God.
That's right.
Therefore, you think that their disciples would be quiet people, not very active. It's God's will. That's all. And on the contrary, the disciples of Muhammad were enormously energetic, and so were the disciples of Calvin, by far the most active of all the Protestant groups, the ones that we belong to. They were the ones who were always doing the things that had to be done, and yet they were very strong in belief. Our works didn't go for anything, right? It was all by the grace of God. Any light on that one?
Well, actually, the arguments over predestination in Presbyterianism reflect very similar arguments in Islam. The total lordship of God, but the requirement on the individual to stretch to his limit, to do the best that he can. And there were indeed debates about this. I don't need to say to you that the Islamic literature is of vast size and covers many societies, many centuries, and it would take a person far more skillful than I to give anything like a disciplined view of all of the different elements of Islamic belief. But we'll hope next Sunday that we can get into the question of doctrine. We'll plan to get into the question of doctrine and discuss that, and these questions I'm sure will come up again. Well, I think our time is up. Thank you very much indeed for your attention to it.